Hey guys, we're here today to really go over some of my experiences with specifically the Design Studio SDK. This is the agenda. I'm going to really quickly just talk about IP from, what we make, or, how do we make money, what do we do, and then also how we're set up from a technical infrastructure perspective. And I'm going to try to cover that really quickly so we can get to really the meat of it, which is the Design Studio extensions themselves, and then look at a couple of use cases. And then close out with a couple of final thoughts just really on, any challenges, or maybe even you could call them challenges or wish list items that I'd like to see maybe in the future. So what do? We make paper and packaging materials like container board, industrial packaging, consumer packaging. So I have a couple of examples there, just kind of tangible examples of the products that you would use that we make on the right there. And you can see, I won't read this slide out verbatim to you, but we are headquartered in Memphis. We have a lot of employees, and if you want to know more information, there's our corporate website there on the bottom. From a technical perspective, we've been a long-time BW implementation, as well as traditionally a Crystal Crystal Enterprise shop, where we've updated to BW 7.4 earlier last year, and then along with that, we're planning on actually going to DI platform SP7 in a couple of months, and then we're looking at 4.2 down the road, maybe later this year. We did last year also install the Design Studio 1.5 runtime. We're kind of we can't take every update, so while I'd like to be on the latest and greatest all the time, just our release schedule, we couldn't always be applying support packs, but we are looking at going to Lumira server 1.29 later this, I think in a couple of months as well. And along with that, we take the opportunity to pull things out that we don't see usage in anymore, something like BusinessObjects Explorer, since we're more actively looking at Lumira. And this is just another way of looking at it from a BI perspective. When, I think SAP, they typically break them into some form of these categories. I think they may call it agile visualization instead of slice and dice. But really, this just kind of gives you a sense in terms of product names, what we have used in the past and where we want to end up. So we are a pretty heavy Bex web shop. I'm trying to, we as the BI group are trying to push that back to analysis for Office and some web-based Design Studio kind of analytic templates, similar to like something you do in Bex Web Application Designer, those of you who are familiar with BW. And then really, along with that type of dashboard-y type use case that traditionally we would have used with Bex Web Application Designer or Excelsius dashboards, we're trying to shift that over to Design Studio and Lumira. Reporting is pretty much, as you can see, they're Webby and Crystal and some other tools, and we're trying to make it less other, so trying to rein them into our standard tool set, when we can, and, really try to mature just with self-service, that last item there, and actually try to either get the buy-in from our organization to stand up a COE or a BICC to actually make that a winnable goal, but right now it's a little chaotic. Okay, so that was about IP. Did that hopefully pretty quick so we can spend most of the time talking about the extensions themselves. And really, within this overview, what I wanted to give just an idea of what are the types of extensions that we're talking about. Why would you use these things? If you did want to develop them themselves, what are the skills that you're needing from a technical and maybe a soft skills perspective? And then just a really basic, at least just understanding of what the composition of those extensions looks like. So this is a slide, and I wanted to leave a Lumira example counterpart in here because they are similar in some ways. So I don't know if anybody on the webinar has played with the Lumira VizPacker extensions, but as compared to Design Studio, they're both HTML5 based, and they do share some commonality between them. Now, they are apples and oranges in a number of other ways, but I did want to kind of put this little, usage matrix, so to speak, up here to say, well, they both have data access extensions or data source extensions, extensibility options available. Yes, they both can do visualization extensions, but some of these just don't make sense in one tool or the other. So a good example is there's no scripting API really, so to speak, in Lumira, whereas you have some options there from a SDK perspective available. So this is just really an overview slide, but what we'll focus on talking about today is the items under Design Studio, which are the data source extensibility, the visualization extensions, and some kind of componentry along with that. So the one thing I'll say about the data source extension is that it's all JavaScript based, unlike something like Lumira that's really got a Java backend where you can get a little bit more flexible with it because it's not just client-side code. But I do have an example of something that I was able to create using the data source extension. Within the visual component category, there's really 2 or 2.5, I'll say, types of visualization components. And what I mean by that is you have the UI5, SAP UI5 handler, which means you can use SAP's UI5 library to, if there was a really cool drop-down or UI5 component out of the box available, you can port that in over to Design Studio using the UI5 handler. If you just want to create like an HTML div element-based or SVG-based type of visualization or component, you would choose the div handler. So imagine it is just like you start with an empty div and you can just write raw HTML. If you have come from like a webmaster background, it's pretty straightforward once you get everything set up. And really this third one, the CVOM chart extension, I think that was new with 1.3 or 1.4, I can't remember which. And I will touch on that in an example, is a way to take something, and the CVOM is a chart extension that is shared between Lumira and Design Studio, or they use that same CVOM chart extension pattern. And so that's also a different type of extension, a different way to install it, so to speak. But there are some things to think about. And anyway, we'll touch on that in depth in a slide coming up. Also, along with any of these extensions, or the UI5 or div handler or data source extension handlers, you can create your own script API. So those of you who have used Design Studio have seen this event-driven script window-based kind of model where you can write JavaScript-like language. And so if you need to open up some custom methods or functions in your components, you can actually expose them. And so that's what I mean by that scripting section. And now with 1.29 of Lumira and Design Studio, now with 1.29 of Lumira, they're available on the server for visualizations and actually technically data access extensions for version 2, and they've always been available in Design Studio. So anyway, that's just an overview of what we're talking about in terms of just high level, what types of extensions and what are some of the things that you can do with them. So why would you use these things to begin with? And I think the way to look at it is if you follow like the rule of 80-20, or where SAP can't really account for every single requirement or use case that a customer is going to have. So at some point you're going to run into something that you just can't do without out-of-the-box components. So their answer to that is to expose an SDK or API to allow you to build them yourself. And I have an example of this next topic is reuse and automation of something that you could probably get away with just creating kind of like a Frankenstein component of like if you took a panel and a bunch of buttons and then you make it look like an action sheet or a pop-up. Would there be a better way of doing that instead of it taking 10 components to put something together and a lot of via action language scripting to achieve something that you would think should be a pretty easy thing with to do out of the box. So anyway, I'll talk about an example of the reuse and automation when we get to the use cases. If you're an organization that may has an investment on some other web-based solutions, maybe you've got an application development group that is creating some HTML5 based components or charts, or maybe you're licensed to use certain charting engines. You can, a lot of times, and even more so now with some additional support from SAP with some module loading capabilities, take those existing investments that you have on these types of components and wrap them into a Design Studio extension. And with, varying degrees of work to do that, but in a lot of cases it may not be as much work as you think. And then finally, the ability to actually create a new type of data source. Today, again, I mentioned it's limited to JavaScript. So think of things like web service calls, or in design time level capability that you could do. So if you're going to rely on compiled code to do something, using like a Java backend, that's not there yet. But maybe I think that's actually an item on my wish list to talk about. But just know that you could probably do anything that you could achieve in a web browser. You could make it work in a data source handler extension. So, there's all these reasons to use the extensions, but are they right for you? So I think there's three thoughts that come to mind is, you could develop them in-house, but you're really going to have to, I think, look at your varying IT groups and say, okay, well, do we have the right people in the right roles to develop these things? How often is this SDK prone to change? Are we going to be doing a lot of maintenance and having to regression test? And I think these are all important things to think about. And depending on if you're, I guess, a technology company or a mill products company, or maybe your IT department is just you, I mean, that's a hard question sometimes to answer. So there are commercial extensions available that handle all that for you, and they're obviously out there to make money doing it. So there's a cost factor there. Sometimes they release free versions, but so if you don't want to get into the business of developing it yourself, I should say there are commercial partners out there that are selling these things or giving them away. And then thirdly, I've been really a big advocate of open source and just kind of sharing ideas and components along with Carl from SAP. So we've kind of teamed up, and you can read more about it on SCN, and we've got a pretty large library of just use it or don't, kind of a open source SCN library. And, there's no guarantee of maintenance or bug fixes or anything, but you could even choose to use that, and then maybe you start open source, and then you find a couple of components you really like and you want to customize them more. Well, then consider maybe bringing it in-house and forking the code. It's all open source, and creating something new. So in order to actually create something new, you really have to, I guess, understand what we're talking about in terms of skills. So I would say you need a basic understanding of how the BI platform is architected, just real basic, so you know what bits of code are running where. So a lot of this is browser side, so it is HTML5 based, so a lot of the stuff is JavaScript, CSS, and HTML, but there is this script API that you can use, and that does run on the server, so you just kind of at least have to know how, and plus how to install these things. That you do have to install them on the server, and it's really easy to install, but just an understanding of what the BI platform is. And I mentioned HTML5, so having a strong background in JavaScript is going to be a huge benefit. And I mentioned a couple of popular libraries down there at the bottom, or on the second bullet. I'd say RequireJS in the past hasn't been that important, but now that they're supporting RequireJS fully, that you can do some really, it's a better way to manage your JavaScript includes or your code if you modularize your code. So understanding the RequireJS loader is very important. And if you're going to get into the visualization side of it, consider D3. It's an open library out there, and I've got links in the back of this deck in the appendix that you can reference. It comes included out of box with Design Studio. So, or you can bring your own libraries too, but these are the ones that I found to be important, and they're all included with Design Studio. And I won't spend any time talking too much about HTML and CSS. Obviously, you're using JavaScript to render something on the screen, so you'd have to have a foundation HTML and CSS, and probably in particular a canvas or SVG component if you're going to do something like render a chart. I guess non-technical wise, be patient. I know it was infuriatingly difficult for me to figure out why my code wasn't working, so become patient with the F12 developer tools in Internet Explorer or Chrome. I would highly recommend, if you have the ability, to install the free VisualStudio.net Community Edition. It's got a really useful debugger that will actually halt execution. You can see the state of your JavaScript variables and figure out why it's throwing exception and figure out what you're doing wrong. And I've got a bunch of other debugging tips later in the appendix and a couple coming up. Get creative with it. I mean, maybe you're having to look at the SDK because of a feature gap, but you can, if you think about it long enough, you can come up with some pretty interesting visualizations. But don't, and I think what I mean with that last section there is don't go overboard with it. Don't do something crazy like try to write a OLAP processor inside the application or an app inside an app, or just something that kind of outgrows the intent of the Design Studio IDE. So real briefly, I wanted to give just a couple of visuals of those who've never seen Eclipse or know what it is to say, hey, this is what you write in a Design Studio extension, and it's Eclipse. So that's for anybody who is a developer on the call. They've probably seen it, understand how that works. But if you don't, first thing I would suggest is go figure out how to use Eclipse and get comfortable in there. There are a couple of quirky things when it comes to actually bundling these extensions to go hand to your designers. So you can run Design Studio out of Eclipse, but once you get ready to actually distribute that extension, when you're done, it can kind of be a little funky. But there's help online to get around that. And now this one actually is a little bit dated. As of 1.6, I don't think that you have to restart your APS, which is the Adaptive Processing Server on your BI platform, every time you deploy an extension bundle, which is great news. That means that you don't have to bother your admin group to restart a server for you every time you've incrementally improved your extension. I left this one here because when we talk about CVOM, this is the type of environment that SAP would provide you with Web IDE to get started with a CVOM extension. So it's a VizPacker plugin that runs in Web IDE on HTTP, and I know that's a lot of acronyms all in a row, but there is documentation online about this. You'll probably find most of it in the Lumira space on SCN, but it would apply to developing a CVOM extension and pulling that into Design Studio, and I have an example of that coming up in a minute. And just some things to think about is it is a cloud-based IDE, which sometimes would make your, information security group or legal group freak out. So, I mean, you can do this stuff in Eclipse, but Web IDE with the VizPacker plugin is a great way to generate all the boilerplate code for you. So, if you do decide to develop a CVOM chart extension, you'd want to get that boilerplate code somehow and start at least there. So I won't spend a lot of time here, but this is the library versions as of today. This in Design Studio 1.6. So if you are thinking about leveraging any of these libraries, and if it's a bleeding edge UI5 component, just double check and make sure that version of UI5 has what you're going to use. And also D3 has been updated to 3.5.3. If you are looking at using D3, at least the version that's included in Design Studio, just make sure that your version supports what you're trying to do based on, maybe any examples that you're using. And like I mentioned, you can include your own libraries. Feel free to do so. Just throw them in your Eclipse project and reference them and load them like I'm talking about here with Require. So, the whole point of Require is you don't have to rely on global objects anymore. So you can, without disrupting other components using older versions of, like in this example, D3, pull in newer versions and isolate it in scope, and that's the whole point of using D3, or rather Require. And what I wanted to point out here is don't think that the versions don't change, because they have, and just, even from me initially starting in 1.2, I mean, this was the environment I had to work with, that version of UI5, and as time progressed and the UI5 libraries progressed with it, it seems that Design Studio has kept up with it pretty well. But, just based on this trajectory, it seems like that's going to be prone to change, right? So just bear that in mind, at least in particular with UI5. And I haven't seen anything, this is just a side note, I haven't seen anything change in Lumira. So if you are interested in developing Lumira extensions, it seems to be, at least from what I've seen today, none of these versions have changed. So that's kind of an interesting comparison of what's different between these two products. So when we start talking about the handlers, I mentioned earlier that there's a div type handler and a UI5 type handler. This is just, the actual names of them, and just to explain in more depth that you can read later on to understand what they're for. The one thing I do want to call out is, as of Design Studio 1.6, there's these two modes that it runs in now. There's a M mode for SAP.M, which is a certain package of the UI5 library, so to speak, along with the older Commons mode. I think they call it Classic mode in Design Studio. And Classic mode is, if you've used Design Studio before 1.6, that's the mode that I'm talking about. It's just know that that's Classic, and if you want to use the M components, there's this new M mode. I think that based on what I've read, they're going to slowly transition maybe to M mode being the main mode of operation, but today you have the choice of either. And so how that pertains to this UI5 handler is, if you do go to Classic mode without doing some hacks, the M mode libraries aren't available to you, and the same applies to M mode. The Commons components, without loading them yourself, aren't available to you. So just something to bear in mind. And you can develop a component that supports both modes. You just, if it were to be a UI5 component, you would, have to accommodate with that for, maybe a classic or a Commons version of what you have in an M mode component. If you don't know what UI5 is, then all that probably sounds great. Don't worry about it. There's a lot of documentation and a couple of examples coming up. And down here at the bottom, I wanted to mention that really CVOM chart extensions don't really have a concept of handlers at all, but I did want to mention those down there. They use a chart feeding approach that is really specific to the CVOM chart extension model or API. So a lot of times when I'm talking about properties or parameterization or scripting extensions or methods, that doesn't apply to CVOM chart extensions. They're a little different. Now, from the extensions point of view, these are really the files that, if you get online and start reading about it, that you see mentioned a lot of times. Really, the two I have in bold there are the two that you really need to worry about if this is the first time you've been exposed to SDK. There's a contribution XML file that really defines how your component is going to behave and the properties that are available and script methods and how many components are part of this extension that you're writing. And then the JavaScript file is really, the meat of the visualization or the component that you're going to work on. And then you have these optional script files, the ZTL file, and the, any supplemental CSS files or that you would need to load. Again, there's a great tutorial by Dave Stalker, and he will go down to line by line explaining to you and holding your hand all the way through to understand what the heck all the contents of, like files like contribution.xml are. So there'd be no way I could cover it, but I just wanted to at least mention them by name so you knew what it would pertain to. And then, like I mentioned, debugging can be a little infuriating at times until you know how to make it less infuriating. So a couple of tricks I've picked up along the way is, if you're unit testing your component and something's not working, or you get a blank canvas or a pinwheel of death, you can hit Control-Alt-Shift-D, and if you're writing out to your console log, you can get to your JavaScript console to see what's going on. You can also see if you're running out of Java heap and actually even trigger garbage collection if you're doing something really weird or something that requires a lot of RAM, or see if maybe you're causing a memory leak. Runtime debugging, just if you're a webmaster or a website developer, just use your F12 tools. If you throw an exception, you can trap it, debug, see what the state of your local and global objects are. That's nothing specific to Design Studio. If you're troubleshooting the script level stuff, then you'll see me kind of interchangeably call it ZITL or BI action language. It's the same thing. That's really what I meant by like some of this stuff runs in the server side. There's this server-side JavaScript sandbox. I think they use RhinoJS, where it feels a whole lot like JavaScript. In your script window, you can do a lot of JavaScript-like stuff. You get a little bit more freedom when you actually develop your own methods, but that freedom comes at a cost. If you write bad code, it's not going to tell you it's bad like you get in the script window. You're actually going to have to debug it yourself. So one way to go about doing it is similar to like how you'd spam the console.log with stuff. You could do application.log, and it'll actually write out to your Design Studio app application log. Another one that they added recently was if you do write an additional property sheet, which is basically a web page itself. The one thing with Design Studio is it's going to like suppress all errors, so you can't really, there is no like F12 debugger within Design Studio, so you've got to have some way to at least communicate with yourself to see, if something is working the way you intended, and that's what they now inject this log function, so you can, write out a message and give it a severity if you want to. And then really this, if you're just doing something and you cannot figure it out, you can install the .NET debugger or Community Edition. It comes with a really nice debugger, and you can really figure out or pick around and see what's going on. Okay, so all the gory details around the technical stuff being said, I did want to share some of just a few use cases of what we've actually or I've created along the way. So these are really basic examples in some cases. So I'm going to start with just one that, is a debatable utility. I mean, some people hate pictograms, think they're a waste of space, but they can be visually engaging as well, I guess, depending on how much real estate you have in your application to show one. And maybe this is one that would eventually make its way into maybe Lumira, because they do get into the more colorful storyboards and whatnot. But it's kind of an interesting way of showing a single KPI. So anyway, that was possible. I used a D3 example, which is in the appendix, to actually not start from scratch. And what you see here on the right, I know it's difficult to probably see on the webinar, is all the properties available. And this is something that you'll see common as we go along, is a lot of the times you need to parameterize your visualization. It's not enough just to bind it to data and you're done. You want to control things like color and size, or how many icons do I want in columns and rows? Do I want the fill order to be forward or backward? On and on and on. And each visualization is going to have its own set of parameters. So a lot of times you can use the default property sheet. What we also use a lot is the additional property sheet, where you can get more flexibility instead of just primitive integer and string type properties. Next, this is a use case, and this isn't the end product. This is just to explain the problem. There's a really interesting example that Mike Bostock, the author of D3, came up with hexagonal binning, which is to take points in a space and then bin them into hexagons. So if you can imagine maybe a data set looking something like this, where it's just basically looks like a pile of gumballs or marbles, you don't really get a sense of density. You don't know if this is equally distributed or if it's more dense here or somewhere else. A scatter plot wouldn't be the best way to go about visualizing it. So I took that example, took this same data, and ran it into this hexagonal binning equivalent, and I'm going to let the video run as I talk over it. But it's the same data set, so you can see now with these bins, these hexagon bins, it's taking those data points that would occur in that space and then bending them into hexagons, and then applying a color scale on top of that to get a better sense of where's the densest maybe correlation or region of these points occurring. And And as you're seeing the hexagons change in size, that's again another example of being able to parameterize these visualizations to tailor it to what your designer would want to actually have control over. So whether it be the type of scale or the colors even, these are all reasons to you can get very sophisticated very quickly with this, depending on how much control you want over that stuff. And the radius also would be an example of something that maybe you want to take a large sample, like a 25 pixel radius, and bin all the points there, or maybe you need them to be smaller. And again, I do have examples of all of these, like where I got the source code. So I'm not trying to take credit for anything that they've built, but I did have to parameterize a lot of these. So there is some code to make it parameterized instead of like the simple examples, but they all did start from, any of these D3 ones did start from, not from scratch. They did start from an example that I found. What I also wanted to mention, and it's part of really a larger story, is I was able to port this over to Lumira after the fact, and I mentioned that parameterization in Lumira is a little bit more difficult, and you can really only today do it in the compose room versus the visualize room, and that's okay for now. I mean, it'd be nice to have it in the visualize room, but I think right now at least it's easier, or you have more control in Design Studio. But again, there's a path, and really this is to illustrate. I'm using D3, like I mentioned, that are available in Lumira and Design Studio. So you really, I mean, if you started in Design Studio and you think it was a good idea to maybe bring it into Lumira, they do share a lot of that same underlying code or libraries, and you could have some success with doing that. And then it comes back to, all right, well, I just developed that in VizPacker that I mentioned earlier, which is a CVOM chart extension, way of creating a CVOM chart extension. Well, what's the CVOM extension thing all about that they had? So I turned around and then took that same hexagonal binning example I did in Lumira and said, okay, well, wouldn't it be nice if I could just develop it in one place for both tools and not have to maintain two forks of code? So as it turns out, you can, but I mean, you're going to be a little bit limited here. And what I wanted to show in this screenshot first is this chart feeder is the same type chart feeder you would see like in the visualize room of Lumira. So there is commonality there, and it should feel familiar to somebody who has experience in Lumira and Design Studio. The problem is I don't know of a way to apply any parameters to that. So you're going to be stuck with this blue and the 15 pixel radius. I couldn't find any documented way to expose any of those additional chart parameters to a CVOM chart extension in Design Studio. Maybe for simple ones that's okay, but in my case I like to parameterize, so I feel like currently it's a little bit limiting. Prior to 1.5, I played around with another D3 example called, and again, I'm just going to let the video run here. Mike Balstock has also a library called TopoJSON, which allows you to project maps in a 2D space like an SVG. So what that basically means is I wanted to, and again, this was prior to SAP having out-of-box maps, just play around with the use case of rendering my own map, like an area map, or you could call it a choropleth map. So it's not tile-based in this example. It is really going to fill a region or a shape, and you can see in the video there I'm even playing around with different types of map projections. So even though SAP has their own mapping component, there are some things that you would maybe consider an extension like this to fill, like even like maybe a projection like a globe, like that one that just came up here in the video. So that's kind of an interesting way to visualize a GeoJSON map. And if you don't know what GeoJSON is, that's just basically an expression of geographic regions. And in a moment here, it'll actually show like it light up with some actual data, because to draw a map is fine, but you're here to actually visualize some information. So you can see, I played around with shading the regions based on a given measure, with or without balloons or bubbles overlaid on top of the centroid of each region. So again, it's another good example of a lot of parameterization you can do within Design Studio. And a lot of times you'll end up having to write an additional properties sheet to facilitate all those properties. And I should call that out too. I mean, from the start, it was I found myself spending more time writing the property sheet than the visualization component, and that frustratingly became too tedious. And so if you're interested, there's online documentation or source code on how Carl and I now do it and automate all that APS generation. So if you find yourself using a color palette property a lot, you could just follow a pattern, and the additional properties sheet just renders itself. So we're pretty proud of that. This is just a still image of the same chloroplast maps, just to point out, yeah, with all the different projection options you have, you can get kind of creative with the output. And then moving on, I guess, from visualizations are some Fiori inspired components. This was before 1.6, where SAP's made this a little more standard. When you think about responsive UI, what's the best way to expose an action sheet on a desktop versus a phone? Am I going to have to write two different Design Studio components to do that, or could I look at maybe some libraries that are inherently responsive? So what you're seeing here is an action sheet button on the top that would come out like a normal drop-down, versus the phone form factor. It's the same dashboard or BI app, but it has a different behavior because it senses it's on an iPhone and then gives you a different way to select. Again, in 1.6, they now have an M mode, an out-of-box component called an action sheet that does that for you. So maybe not this example being a good one anymore, but it did have a pretty good use. Or maybe you're not on 1.6, you could consider doing something like this. And I talked about reusability, so I'm just really now just dissecting that example to say, all right, well, some of these older Design Studio templates actually had action sheets. I know I saw them in a template, right? Well, it took like 11 components to create it, and a lot of BI action language scripting. And what if I wanted to add a new item? Now I got to move things around and all that. So this is just a call out, not to pick on their template, but just to say, if you're doing something similar and you just feel like it's tedious, maybe it's time to consider a component that just does it for you. So, and I do mention down here they now do have their own action sheet component. So, try it out if you're looking for something like that. And then data source-wise, there is what I still use and abuse to this day, one that I call Bring Your Own Data. And basically what that allows you to do is, as you can see as this video plays in the bottom right, is just create data on the fly, right? I mean, and instead of going to find a UNX or a Cube or a HANA Calc view or whatever that has, some dummy data to write so you can actually start creating a chart, or maybe you're just working offline or don't want to connect to your VPN or just messing around, you could use something like a Bring Your Own Data component to create data on the fly and see it change. So you see these little progress bar indicator charts changing as I'm changing the data live. It almost feels like Excelsius for those who have used Excelsius. You kind of I think a lot of times I've talked to somebody who uses Excelsius. They're like, well, I just want the spreadsheet back. I mean, I want to, that's just kind of like a pattern that today isn't really there in Design Studio. With I think what was it, 1.5, they came out with a CSV extension, CSV data source out of the box. I haven't played with it a whole lot, and I've found that you actually have to generate the CSV based on data, and then you have to upload it into your app. And it's just, to me, it continues to be just easy just to change it in the additional property sheet instead of having to mess around with modifying a CSV. But if you don't choose extensions, maybe their CSV data source would work for you in a pinch. And I guess just finally, in terms of the visualizations, there's I played around with other libraries like jQuery, data tables, to do some pretty interesting tabular visual, just a standard table to say, all right, well, what can I do at runtime instead of having a script filtering out columns and all this? Well, they have a pretty nice show hide columns context menu out of box, searching within your result set using regular expressions even. So, and it's also responsive. So as you were to see this same table over here on a mobile form factor, the columns will collapse on themselves and you can press them and expand. So it just is another example of what is possible using libraries that are already out there.